Racial inequities in the U.S. judicial system have profoundly impacted the lives of people of color. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we witnessed the legacy of racial discrimination in laws and policies governing our criminal justice, housing, and education systems. The Hampton Roads Community Foundation has been at the forefront of efforts aimed at ensuring a more equitable and inclusive community for the people of Hampton Roads, and in 2018 made a commitment to focus on racial equity as a part of its strategic direction. During this virtual discussion on racial inequities in law, we'll hear from two law professionals who will share their lived experiences navigating inequitable laws as people of color. Dr. Kiara Bridges is a professor of law at UC Berkeley School of Law and has written many articles concerning race, class, reproductive rights, and the intersection of the three. Her scholarship has appeared in several law reviews, including Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and the Virginia Law Review. Dr. Bridges is also the author of 3 books, the most recent titled Critical Race Theory, a Primer. And Wendell Taylor is a managing partner at Hutton Andrews Kurth in the District of Columbia and elected member of the firm's executive committee. His practice focuses on sensitive internal and government white-collar investigations and a range of antitrust-related matters. Mr. Taylor created the virtual podcast Our Pain Days following the tragic murder of George Floyd to describe his negative encounters with law enforcement as a way to foster empathy for the plight of many African Americans in this country. They will share how they teach, interpret, and defend against the backdrop of discriminatory laws that have been enforced for centuries. They will also offer meaningful ways to advocate for systemic change. Underpinned by the belief that racial equity is essential to the success of the region and its people, the Hampton Roads Community Foundation has been fiercely committed to leading courageous conversations that address and challenge structural racism in our region and beyond. Tonight, we continue these conversations with the goal of creating a more equitable and thriving community with opportunity for all.
The FBI directed me.
Thank you, Vivian, for that kind welcome and introduction. And thank you all for tuning in for tonight's program. I must say I've been looking forward to this discussion and am so pleased to join as your moderator for the evening. In the work my colleagues and I do at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, we are constantly engaging in meaningful dialogue on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But tonight is a really special opportunity to hear two scholars who will share their perspectives on racial inequities embedded in our laws and policies, sharing both as African Americans and as law professionals. I want to thank the Hampton Roads Community Foundation for creating this critical space where we can have such productive conversations about issues connected to race in our community. Before we begin tonight, I want to take a moment to offer our sincerest thoughts and condolences to the families that have been affected by the tragic school shooting in Texas today. And our thoughts and prayers continue to be with the families and friends of the victims who were killed in the recent massacre in Buffalo, New York. Will you please join me in a moment of silence? Thank you. In light of what transpired in Buffalo in particular, it is important that we acknowledge the increased need for these types of forums that promote understanding and that overcome fears to ensure safe and vibrant communities for all people here in the Hampton Roads region and beyond. I also want to take a moment to thank tonight's event partners, Hunton Andrews Kurth and Kaufman and Knowles. As you heard in Vivian's introduction, our distinguished panelists bring a wealth of knowledge to our conversation. Dr. Kiara Bridges is a professor of law at the UC Berkeley School of Law, and Wendell Taylor is the managing partner at Hunton Andrews Kurth in Washington, D.C. Before we get started with our conversation, I want to encourage you, our viewers, to engage respectfully on social media. As you share your thoughts throughout the evening, please make sure that you use our hashtag RaceAndLaw757. That's hashtag RaceAndLaw757. We have a lot to cover this evening, so let's get right to it. And to begin, I'd love to hear from our panelists a bit about how you each got into the law profession, what drove your passion to practice or teach law. Kiara, let's get started with you.
Yeah, I often tell the story of when, being asked when I was 7 years old what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I would respond, I want to be a lawyer. And I don't know why I wanted to be a lawyer, but I did want to be a lawyer. And so I am very goal oriented. And so I stayed true to that 7-year-old's dream and eventually went to law school. What brought me to law teaching, though, was discovering once I was in law school that the most interesting parts of law school were the research and the writing. I just the other parts of practicing law, the drafting of the motions and the meetings, and that didn't appeal to me as much as research and writing. And so someone told me that I could devote my life to research and writing about the law by becoming a law professor. And so that's what I did. So that's my story.
Thank you, Kiara. Wendell, same question for you. Tell us a bit about your path and your passion.
Thank you, Jonathan. So my story starts when I was a kid as well, but growing up, all my friends would say, you should go to law school. And when your friends tell you that when you're a kid, they're not giving you a compliment. They're just upset that you're winning an argument with them or something like that. But that's probably the first time I ever thought about it. But when I was in college, my prevailing view was that I didn't want to get a job after school. And so I certainly wanted to stay in school as long as possible. So that was reason number 2. And reason number 3 is I felt like in college, I was kind of a fearful kid and I never did the scary things. And there's a really cool quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is, "Do the thing you fear and death of fear is certain." And, for me, the scariest thing I could even imagine doing when I was in college was to go to law school. So that's what I did. And going to a large firm, being one of very few African Americans at a large firm was obviously pretty scary as well. And so I really kind of, leaned into those opportunities, was at my firm for about 5 years before working at the Department of Justice as counsel to Deputy Attorney General Jim Comey, and then was a federal prosecutor in D.C. And came back to my firm a few years later, and I've been managing partner of the D.C. office for about 5 years.
Thank you for that, Wendell. Kiara, I'm curious about the intersection of your identities and your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you show up as a Black woman in a profession that hasn't always valued your voice?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think my first kind of response to it is that I actually feel like my profession values my voice. And that's simply because it's a large profession. There are a lot of people in it. And while there are certainly sectors of it, maybe even large sectors of it, that could care less about what a Black woman has to say, there are others that are very interested in it. I get a lot of strength from the positive feedback that I get from my students, from my colleagues, from observers of my work, from people outside of the legal academy. And so I maybe it's I am disillusioned or I'm living in some sort of delusion, but I actually feel incredibly valued as a legal scholar who is a woman of color. That being said, I try really hard to be a Black woman in the academy. And by that, I mean that I never sanitize who I am. I never try to make people comfortable. I wear my hair as big as possible when the humidity allows. I have a septum piercing. I wear big jewelry. I'm from the South, so y'all sneaks in there ever so often. In my scholarship, I have footnotes that cite the Biggie Smalls, Outkast, Andre 3000, right? So I show up, I bring my entire history with me to my scholarship, to the Legal Academy. And in bringing my history with me to the Legal Academy, I'm hoping to transform the Legal Academy such that 25 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, women of color, people of color, don't have to worry about speaking to segments of the legal academy or to the law profession. Instead, they can feel comfortable speaking to everyone and feeling valued by everyone.
Yeah, it's powerful, Kiara, to hear your example there and to hear the modeling that you do, holding your identities and the work you do in the academy. I'm curious if there's anything in particular that you think about as you prepare your students for practicing law, if there are any personal experiences that you share with them, especially students of color who are entering the profession.
Yeah, so first of all, I remind students, I sort of hold myself, maybe not always consciously, but I hold myself out as a person that they should feel free to emulate if they so desire, right? A person who speaks passionately, doesn't kind of edit herself. I think my scholarship is powerful because you can read the emotion in it. And a lot of law, and especially in legal academia, we're supposed to be these dispassionate, like third-party observers. And I feel that that is dishonest. And I feel like we lose something by trying to extract humanness from the things we're writing about, especially when we're writing about something like racial injustice or sexism, misogyny, transphobia, ableism, so on and so forth. So I put myself out there to my students as someone that I could be a role model if they are attracted to that idea. But I also remind them that I have tenure, right? Like I'm not going anywhere. Nobody can fire me. So I try to help them navigate the vulnerabilities that come from beginning a career in the law, being a young associate, and also trying to be who they are, to bring their histories, bring their social context, so on and so forth, to their careers. And so, like I said, I hope that they transform the legal profession at the same time.
Thank you. It's really helpful to hear how you navigate the academy, and the role of tenure, I think, is an important one. So I appreciate you lifting that up. Wendell, let's bring you into the conversation. I'm interested in hearing a bit from you, both at the firm and then also in your work at the Justice Department. How do you navigate practicing law as an African-American man, especially against a backdrop of inequitable and biased laws and practices that have historically and even in the present day limit opportunity for people of color?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the first thing I thought about when I started as a young associate at a firm, Hutton and Richmond at the time probably had 200 lawyers, and I think there were only 2 African Americans, and one of which was Justice John Charles Thomas, who graduated from UVA Law in 1975. He was the first African American lawyer in any Southern firm to come up through a firm and make partner there in '82 at Hutton. And the things he had to deal with were extreme compared to what I had to deal with. So the first thing I thought of was what an amazing opportunity I had, just being basically just a second generation of African Americans at major law firms, but also what a great responsibility that was. We talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, and I really felt like that. It really stuck with me that, my tenure at the firm then as an associate at the Justice Department, back at the firm, was, I had the responsibility to open doors for people that look like me, as those doors had been opened for me, and to, create space for people like me to come in and do the work like the good work. If you think about it, space is created sometimes for folks to have, opportunities. And if you don't fulfill that space goes away. Think of muscles that, if you don't use them, you lose them, right? Think of budgets. If you don't spend the amount that has been given to you for a budget, they're going to cut your budget the next year. So I feel like when there are opportunities for African Americans to step in leadership roles, it's my responsibility to fill that so that the folks behind me can have those opportunities too. And, when I came to Hutton, I had some, friends who said, look, why are you going to go to a big white firm? You go to this black firm or this firm where they have more folks that look like you. I always just thought it was an opportunity for me to, again, open doors for others. And I've kind of leaned into those situations in my career.
Thank you. I have another question for you, Wendell, a bit about your lived experience and your identity. There's a sense that some people have in society that you must be engaged in criminal activity if you're stopped or mistreated by law enforcement. But certainly we know that is not the case all the time. Wendell, you're the managing partner at Hutton Andrews Kurth in Washington, D.C. And you have had your own encounters for just being a Black man in America. I wonder if you can take a moment to share a bit about your personal experiences with law enforcement and maybe how that fuels your work as an attorney, or how that's impacted how you work with clients of color and or law enforcement.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, I've had many run-ins with the law throughout my career, or throughout my life, really. And I tell, 3 really pivotal stories in a podcast I did called Our Pain. Being the managing partner of the DC office, I felt a need to keep the office together through the pandemic when we were not in the office and we were working virtually. And so every week I would have a weekly coffee talk where I would talk about whatever was the issue of the day, mask policies, whatever Dr. Fauci was talking about during that time, new events and things in the office. And then George Floyd was murdered, and I saw the extreme and profound empathy that we all felt for his plight. And I thought it was a great opportunity for me to double down on that empathy, to share my stories and my negative encounters with law enforcement, because his story was irrefutable. It was unimpeachable. We all watched a man getting murdered on camera, and everyone felt empathy for that. So I thought I could use my Thursday morning coffee talk as a way to double down on empathy just for my small group, the 200 or 300 people in my office. And so that next Thursday morning, I talked about my negative encounters with law enforcement first when I was a 10-year-old boy accused of stealing at a convenience store just, a half a block from my house, a store I would go to every day. And I would leave my book bag outside the store because I knew they would think I was a criminal and I didn't want that label. And seeing this one clerk every day didn't stop him from accusing me of a crime, detaining me until law enforcement arrived and having law enforcement frisk me and search me. Obviously, they didn't find anything. The second story was in college when I was wrongly accused of being in a bar fight. I was, close to the scene, but not at all in the bar or not near it. But the cops saw a Black person. They arrested me, had me in handcuffs, and drove someone by who identified me as the person that was in the fight. Now, obviously, if you're pressed up against a cop car with handcuffs on, that's kind of 9/10 of the way there for someone to think that was you. And so that certainly wasn't fair. Luckily, I played football at the time at Wake Forest. My coach understood the situation, but I still had to explain this situation to the Virginia State Bar before I could even sit for the bar because this arrest was on my record. And the third story was when I was in law school as the president of the Student Bar Association at the time, working during the summer for the prosecutor's office in Richmond. And when I wasn't trying cases, I was writing briefs for them. And this particular day, I was writing an opposition to a suppression motion, basically defending a white police officer's stop of a Black man at a bus station. And I was at my law school where I had an office, because at the CA's office in Richmond, I only had a cube. So when I wasn't in court, I would go back to my law school. And I was in the middle of writing this brief defending this white police officer's stop. And I came downstairs from the office in front of the law library, and a plainclothes police officer asked, my name and asked to see a tattoo on my arm, which I don't have. He grabbed my sleeve, threw me against the wall. And even though I was quoting cases to him, Terry, Ohio, telling him that he did not have the reasonable articulable suspicion to stop me, that still didn't ring a light bulb off in his head that he was talking to a law student in a law building in front of a law library. But he harassed me, threw me against the wall, and he was nose to nose, trying to get as close as he could. He was hoping that I would do something, push him or run to justify this unlawful stop that he did. So in the podcast, I talked about those stories in greater detail to double down on that empathy. And I just had the foresight to record it with my iPhone and, send it around to my office. And before the afternoon was over, I got calls from folks at other firms saying they'd heard it. And I put it on SoundCloud, called it Our Pain, and it has since gone viral. And I think that's the reason that I was invited to speak here tonight.
Wendell, we're just meeting this evening, but actually I knew of you from hearing that podcast a long time ago. And you noted the catalyzing moment that was the tragic killing of George Floyd. Tomorrow marks 2 years actually since that event. So it's, I think, an important moment for us to be engaging in this dialogue and this conversation. I hope you, our viewers, are enjoying this conversation and getting a lot out of it as we hear the personal stories and paths of our two panelists. A reminder to please share your comments with us on social media using our hashtag for the event. That's hashtag Race and Law 757. Again, hashtag Race and Law 757. Kiara, we heard earlier a bit about a book that you had recently written, and I know as a professor of law at the UC Berkeley School of Law, one of the courses you teach includes critical race theory. We've heard a lot about this topic. It's been widely discussed throughout the country and here in Virginia with accusations that it's taught in K through 12 schools. Can you help our viewers to know what is critical race theory and what the origins are of this theory?
Yeah, great question. I want to start by observing that I wrote my primer in 2018. My primer was published in 2018. That's 2 full years before the hullabaloo started. So if you are interested in what critical race theory was before the right learned about the term and decided to politicize it in the way that it has been politicized, I would suggest checking out sources that predate Fox News's coverage of critical race theory. But critical race theory, what my primer is about, is a 40-year-old legal theory that seeks to explain the relationship between law and racial inequality. And so critical race theory emerged in law schools in the 1980s, 1990s, and the impetus for the emergence of critical race theory was the observation that although the civil rights movement had happened, all of these fantastic civil rights laws were on the book, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, even though we had overcome, there was still observable rampant racial inequality in the country. And so those who would become critical race theorists sought to theorize the relationship between formal legal equality and racial inequality on the ground. And so critical race theory is a body of scholarship that does that investigation, looking how it is, investigating how it is that racial inequality endures in a post-civil rights era.
Thank you for explaining that. I think there are a lot of misconceptions, and I want to make sure that our viewers have the chance to understand a few different things about critical race theory. So can you contextualize if there's any relationship between critical race theory and diversity and inclusion training? What's your sense of those two things?
Sure. Let me take notes, because I can and have gone on about this for hours. Let me actually back up a little bit before answering your question about diversity and inclusion trainings by just noting that if your kindergartner is learning critical race theory, congratulations, because your kindergartner is in law school. So critical race theory is not being taught in K through 12 schools, not because it's bad to teach critical race theory in K through 12 schools, but rather because kindergartners through 12th graders do not have the background that they need in order to understand what critical race theory is and what it's about. You need some basic understanding of the Constitution. You need some basic understanding of the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, Due Process Clause. You need some basic understanding of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1965, in order to learn critical race theory. And that's why critical race theory isn't even taught as a first-year course in law schools. This is an advanced course. I didn't take critical race theory until my 2L year, and that was only after I had the baseline knowledge that you need in order to engage with the theory, in order to understand the theory. So one, critical race theory is not being taught in K through 12 schools. What the right has come to call critical race theory is just sort of any talk about race that is not celebratory, that doesn't pat us on the back and say a job well done. We conquered racial injustice. So any talk that the right doesn't like about race has been termed critical race theory. And so the effort is to cleanse schools of instruction like that. And then finally, to actually answer your question, diversity and inclusion trainings, critical race theory is not diversity and inclusion training. There's no chapter in my primer about diversity and inclusion trainings, how to do it. I will say, though, that critical race theorists actually have spent a lot of time critiquing the language of diversity and inclusion. That language tends to focus on just the benefits of bringing people together, while not at all paying attention to the racial injustice, to the trauma, to the marginalization, to the subordination that makes it so that people of color are not in elite institutions of higher learning, are not managing partners all over the country, right? So diversity and inclusion kind of tells like a happy story about race relations, as opposed to interrogating our past and seeking to remedy the injustices in order to produce better futures. One last thing I'll say about diversity and inclusion trainings is that critical race theorists have been critical of diversity and inclusion trainings because they tend to be one-off, isolated kind of get-togethers in institutions where people come together and they learn about each other, and then the institution again pats itself on the back says a job well done, and then goes back to the status quo. So no real transformation happens. So all of that to say, the short answer is no, critical race theory is not diversity and inclusion training.
I appreciate the distinction you're making there, Kiara, between the interpersonal relationship building and culture building versus a structural lens that critical race theory brings. I wonder, though, one of the critiques that we hear from folks about critical race theory is that they think that it is just used as a tool to vilify or shame white people, to promote guilt in white people, and to make Black and brown folks feel like victims. What do you say about that accusation or critique?
Yeah, so it's so important to understand what critical race theory, the legal theory, was responding to. So the legal theory was responding to a series of civil rights laws that focused on the individual, that focused on smoking out bigots, that focused on identifying individual racists. And the idea behind these civil rights laws was, if we can just smoke out these racists, if we can just identify these bigots and get them out of positions of power, then we will achieve racial justice. And so critical race theory was, responded by saying, I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is in structural solutions. So how is racial inequality reproduced in the absence of bigots? How is racial inequality perpetuated without white supremacists with Klan robes on, right? How does racial inequality endure through race neutral means? And what that led critical race theory and critical race theorists to investigate structures, processes, institutions, right, forces. And so critical race theory is not at all interested in the individual, whether it's the white individual as a victimizer or the individual of color as a victim. Instead, it's interested in these large-scale macro processes that function to make it so that white folks tend to be at the top of most measures of social well-being, and people of color are at the bottom of most measures of social well-being. Again, not an individualist focused theory at all, but rather one that's interested in structures, institutions, processes, et cetera.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to take the time to learn from you. And I think it's important for our community, given the amount of misinformation that's been out there about the label critical race theory, to hear from you, to hear from an expert on this. One of the things we've also heard connected to critical race theory is critique about whose history and how we teach history. Wendell, I want to bring you into the conversation. It's been said often that it's important to know our history in order to not repeat our past. And we can think about tragic incidents that have occurred across the country in the last few years, and even what we saw in Buffalo just over a week ago, that remind us of the importance of understanding our history. Wendell, from your perspective, what are your thoughts about critical race theory, and particularly how we might be able to better educate our community to come together in teaching accurate history so that we may be able to move forward together?
That's a great question. Just think about how better off kids would have been growing up that had, they learned about Black Wall Street and, knew that there was Black wealth in this country. All you hear about it, or at least all I did when I was growing up, was that, Black people used to be slaves. There was never any moment in time where we learned that there was Black wealth in this country. And certainly there was no time given to the fact that Black wealth was extinguished by white angry mobs. And so, it's funny, when I was planning one of these talks I've done after our pain, it was for a financial services company in Richmond. And I was talking about the concept of privilege. And I always start with male privilege because I have privileges that women don't have. And I should, note those and account for those, for harmony and for harmony's sake. And so I was pointing out, privilege. And this person, he's, older white gentleman, and he said that he didn't realize that he had benefited from any privilege at all throughout his life because he grew up on his humble family farm. And I didn't know if he was joking or, being serious. I mean, maybe he was being sarcastic, but he was being serious. But, the fact that he had a generations old family farm is the epitome of privilege, because you think about stories like Black Wall Street, where the average African American in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the early 19 teens or 1920s, and the Black Wall Street happened in 1921. They were wealthier than the average white person in Tulsa. And, the white folks in Tulsa couldn't deal with that. And when there was this bogus story about, a black guy raping a white woman, that's all they needed to burn down 35 city blocks, kill hundreds of people, jail hundreds more, injure hundreds more, and more than 9,000 African Americans were left homeless. So yes, a generations old family farm is a privilege that 99.9% of African Americans in this country didn't have. And, we are now just learning about Black Wall Street, but do we know that this situation happened in dozens of cities across the country? Those are the stories that need to be told that we still aren't telling. And again, when I think about things like privilege and bias, I think we're all biased, right? But I think we should take the sting away from bias. When I'm flipping through the channels and I turn to a boxing match and there's a white guy fighting a black guy, I instinctually pull for the black person. Now, how do I, think anything negative about a white guy who's pulling for the white guy, right? That is our implicit bias. The whole point is that we all have those biases, but if we want to have a racially inclusive society, then we need to account for those. And like I said when I started this, that I enjoy male privilege, and I played football in college. And so when I was a young associate at Hunton, I had white partners who would gravitate towards me because they wanted to take me to lunch and hear about my football stories. That's a privilege that I enjoyed that my female counterparts didn't. I was able to make those connections with those partners because of my past, primarily because I was a male and because I was an athlete. And so it's knowing this and having empathy for others and trying to help those that don't have those same opportunities and make sure that work at law firms isn't given out because I could run faster or jump higher than my female counterparts.
Thank you for that. Kiara, is there anything you'd add about understanding history as it relates to critical race theory?
Yeah, no. So I think that, and actually this is outside of my wheelhouse, because as a critical race theorist, like I think about the law, I find it awkward to talk to kindergartners through 12th graders. So I tend not to engage with them, but I believe that, kids should be taught history. And I can just talk about, a very, an experience that I have in my classes. We often hear the story about, the US is a white nation. It's a white country. It's a white country. And a lot of people are interested in protecting the whiteness of the country. But we don't talk about how the US was maintained as a white country. Like, it wasn't an accident, but rather we had laws on the books that ensured that the country was a white one. And so in law school, I tell, we cover in some of my classes a naturalization act that required for a person to be a free white person in order to naturalize as a citizen. And that was on the law, that was good law until 1952. And my students are completely unaware of that. Law students are completely unaware that until 1952, you had to be a free white person in order to become a citizen. And so that did a beautiful job of making sure that citizens were white and that this country was a white nation. Asian folks couldn't naturalize. Latinx folks from Central and South America had to try to prove their whiteness. We have Supreme Court cases in which Armenians and Japanese people are trying to litigate their whiteness because they're trying to naturalize, right? So it's no accident of history that the country is a white one. I tell my students, we cover it in some of my classes, Operation Wetback, which was a program that deported people of Mexican descent. And this was a Depression era sort of a scheme where people of Mexican descent were deported. And I say people of Mexican descent specifically because even citizens, US citizens of Mexican descent were deported, right? We have created the country as a white one. It's not an accident of history. And so if we're interested in dismantling and if we're true to our values that we purport to hold about, difference being valuable and diversity being a good thing, then we might work to interrogate how our history perpetuates itself into the present. And perhaps dismantling some of the residue of that history, we can create a present that's more in line with the values that we purport to hold, the values that are kind of contained in our founding documents like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
I so appreciate you, Kiara, naming laws and thinking about laws that are on the books. Here in Virginia, we know that our Commonwealth has quite a checkered legacy on racism, and that may be putting it mildly. As we continue to reckon with our past, I'm curious from both of you, are there any laws on the books in Virginia generally or Hampton Roads in particular that you're aware of that discriminate based on race and that should be reformed? Either one of you can jump in.
I will leave it up to the esteemed professor to talk about the laws, but I will certainly say, obviously, drug laws in this country have had racial biases for a long time. I'm glad to see those are changing, but policing policies, I think, are huge problems, and I'm glad to see those changing as well. But we know that blacks and whites basically commit crime at about the same rates, but African Americans just have so many more contacts with law enforcement that they're just bound to be arrested, convicted, and spend time in prison for crimes that others are committing that aren't being arrested for. And obviously, we know that sometimes they are arrested for things that they didn't do, right? And the more contacts you have with law enforcement, the more opportunities you have for things to go wrong. Think about the situation of Philando Castile, who was murdered in his car. He had a legal gun. He told the officer, I have a legal gun in my glove compartment. He made one move towards it, and they shot him dead in his car. Philando Castile had been pulled over by police officers 49 times in 13 years. 49 times in 13 years. That is insane. 49 times in 13 years almost makes his death seem inevitable, right? We need to really cut down on the contacts, I think, that African Americans have with law enforcement.
Thank you. Kiara, anything you'd add about laws that are on the books in Virginia or Hampton Roads?
Yeah, no, I would just build on, well, first of all, I think that folks in Virginia should investigate the laws in the state to identify those that are producing unjust outcomes. But I just want to build on what Wendell was saying. It's not just contact with law enforcement. I do a lot of my work is with pregnant and parenting folks, and Black folks, marginalized folks should expect to come into contact with law enforcement at greater frequencies than their privileged counterparts, but they should also expect to come into contact with the welfare state, the state that provides benefits, the state that provides housing, healthcare, shelter, food, clothing. And that state is not solely, I mean, we can actually talk about whether it's even designed to help. It's an incredibly punitive state. It's a state that removes children from their families as opposed to supporting the families. It's a state that punishes with the criminal law failures, parental failures, even though those failures might not be a result of abuse, but rather a result of just poverty, the inability to provide for a child's basic needs. I just want to build on Wendell's response by noting that when we're investigating those laws in Virginia that function to recreate racial inequalities in the state, look at the criminal legal system for sure, but look beyond the criminal legal system and look at all the various contacts that low-income people have with the state. Many of those contacts are punitive. Many of those contacts result in punishment, or many of those contacts sort of reproduce the marginalization that vulnerable groups already experience.
Really important point. Thank you, Kiara, for lifting that up. You know, this has been a really rich discussion, and I know we could continue the dialogue beyond our hour, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure that before we wrap up tonight, we are able to bring in a few questions from our audience. I want to thank folks who have been sharing your questions both in advance and throughout our evening. We've been monitoring feedback on social media, and if time permits, we'll be able to address some of the questions that folks have been raising. So please continue to use our hashtag for the evening, Race and Law 757, as you engage online with tonight's program. Our first question comes from Juanita Leatherberry. She is in Richmond, Virginia, and Juanita asks, do you think racial inequities will ever improve, or do we just go in cycles? Wendell, Kiara, either of you have thoughts on that?
I'll start. I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think anything's inevitable. I think that we produce and reproduce our present. And to the extent that, so we certainly have witnessed racial progress that's been met with racial backlash. We can start with the Civil War, racial progress in the form of Reconstruction, and then retrenchment, backlash in the form of the next 100 years in terms of Jim Crow. Racial progress. Here comes the Civil Rights Movement. Racial backlash. Here comes the Reagan years. Racial progress. George Floyd was murdered, and people were moved to have a racial reckoning. Racial backlash. People are afraid about critical race theory being taught in schools, and books are being burned. So I definitely think that we can observe cycles, but I think that we can interrupt the cycle. That's our job. My job as a law professor is to theorize the cycle, to document it, to note the role of law as a critical race theorist in the cycle. And then critical race theory is such a hopeful theory because we're interested in intervening in these processes, not just observing them, but intervening in them. And so what can we do to intervene, to interrupt the next cycle of racial backlash so that whatever progress we have experienced prior to is not erased? Thanks.
Wendell, anything you'd add on that?
Yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction. I mean, things are, undisputably better, for, say, African Americans in, major law firms today than they were 30 years ago. And I think, I think for the most part, that is our society. I would say it's, different than the old adage, one step forward, two steps back. Maybe it's, two steps forward, one step back. And so we continue to go in the right direction. The quote that kind of stuck with me is, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite quotes, Wendell, and one of the things I've heard folks talk about as an addition to that is that it doesn't bend unless we are consciously moving it in that direction. But I so appreciate you lifting that up. We have another question. It comes from Shantae Charles, who is in Virginia, and Shantae asks, many people say that calling yourself Black according to law means that you're non-existent. Is this factual?
I'll start an answer. It doesn't strike me as factual. According to law, yeah, it doesn't strike me as true in any inevitable sense or even descriptive sense. I think that what people mean by that claim, though, is that the Black has always been described as a negative, right? And not just like negative as in bad, but like as not white. And so white has been, identified with positive qualities like industriousness and beauty and cleanliness, and then Black is just the opposite. But I also feel that, and historians have done this work to identify that that was a dialectical relationship. That the definition of white depends on Blackness meaning a certain thing. So they're co-constitutive. And I mean by that Black is not necessarily a negation. So I think I'll stop and answer right there. I think that what scholars of color have done is, for example, insist upon capitalizing Black in writing so as to identify it as like a subject of the law. As not just the opposite, but like an actual positive existing subject that takes up space in its own right. And like I said before, I don't think that anything is inevitable. And to the extent that Black might be the negation of something else, it's up to us, right, to actively transform those meanings. We don't have to inherit the violences that were perpetuated in generations past. I think our job, our charge is to create new futures for the generations that will succeed us.
Thank you, Kiara. I appreciate you helping to dispel the myth that was there in that question. We are short on time, and so I want us to have the opportunity to hear some final thoughts from each of our panelists as we wrap up our program tonight on racial inequities in the law. We'll have the chance to hear a bit from Kiara and Wendell to share final words as we go out into our own communities to take what we've learned, to advocate for change, particularly at a systemic level, as we heard from our panelists. Before we wrap up tonight, I want to take a moment to thank the Hampton Roads Community Foundation for sponsoring this really important event and creating such a critical space for dialogue. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Bridges and Mr. Taylor, for sharing your personal experiences, for sharing your expertise, for providing such insight on a critical topic. It has been such a joy for me to serve as moderator for the evening, and I appreciate the Hampton Roads Community Foundation giving me the opportunity to be in conversation with you tonight. So we'll hear final comments from Kiara and Wendell, and then afterward, we'll get some closing comments from Dr. Deborah DeCroce, who serves as president and CEO of the Hampton Roads Community Foundation. Kiara, let's start with you. Any final words?
No, I guess I'll just use this as an opportunity to repeat what I said, and that is, nothing is inevitable. I think a lot of the fear of our present moment is fear of change, and to the extent that there are folks who are afraid of change, it means that folks who have been struggling for racial justice have been doing the right thing. So I think that we should keep doing what we have been doing, remain creative, remain engaged, sideline the cynicism, leave that for Friday nights. And just, always be hopeful, because as Wendell said, we are in a different place. There's been lots of progress, right, since the time when my great-great-great-grandmother, was owned by somebody. So I think that we can continue doing what we have been doing, make folks scared. I think I was thinking about the recent hullabaloo over critical race theory, and I was really upset about it for much of 2 summers ago. But I actually should have experienced it as like affirmation that what we had been doing was working. We had folks scared, banning books. So yeah, keep doing what you're doing.
Well, Kiara, thank you for those comments. 2 things that you just said have made me think of a story I want to tell. One, you talked about being hopeful. Another, you talked about your great-great-grandmother. I recently learned from a distant cousin of mine, Margaret LaPierre, of my great-great-grandfather, and it gave me hope. His name was Henry Anderson Brooks. And she'd heard my podcast, Our Pain, and reached out to me to tell me about my great-great-grandfather. He was born enslaved in 1859. And in 1865, the year of Juneteenth, my then 6-year-old great-great-grandfather impressed Union soldiers with his wit and confidence. They were enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation in Richmond, and the commanding officer, Colonel George Ives, was really impressed with Henry. When Henry walked over to him, shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and Colonel Ives said to Henry, "What do you want to do?" And Henry said, "I want to go to school." So Colonel Ives asked Henry's mother, could he take Henry, my great-great-grandfather, to Danbury, Connecticut and educate him. Henry convinced his mother to let him go. It was rocky at first, but Henry thrived in an all-white school in Danbury and later went on to attend Hampton Normal School, which is now Hampton University. The Ives family is one of the first benefactors of Hampton. And the story of my great-great-grandfather and Colonel Ives is chronicled in the Yale Library. I try to embody the spirit of my great-great-grandfather, Henry Anderson Brooks, in seeking knowledge, in trusting people's intentions, and in thriving in situations where very few people look like me. And instead of focusing on the fact that how crazy it is that I'm just the 4th generation born free in this country, that I'm in awe of people like Colonel Ives, who fought against slavery and segregation and racism at a time when it wasn't popular to do so. We talk about judging historical figures by the time they're in. Colonel Ives didn't need that caveat. He was a noble man even during that time. And my great-great-grandfather, Henry Anderson Brooks, and Colonel Ives were on the same team. Colonel Ives believed and trusted Henry, and Henry did the same. And I'm hopeful that we will one day in this country all be on the same team.
Wow, what a powerful conversation. My name is Debbie DiCroce. I'm president and CEO of the Hampton Roads Community Foundation. Our board of directors, my colleagues and I are so pleased that all of you have joined us for this meaningful discussion on a particularly important and very timely topic. Thanks too for your questions, your comments, and continued engagement on social media. And a very special thank you to our distinguished panelists, Dr. Bridges, Mr. Taylor, and Mr. Zur, for leading the discussion. Indeed, our conversation this evening touched on some of the critical issues inherent in the intersection of racial inequity in the law. And we at the Community Foundation think that it's through open forums like this one, as well as continued advocacy to push for more equitable outcomes, that we begin to move a step or two closer toward Dr. King's dream of a racially equitable and just society that, in his words, lives out the true meaning of its American creed of equality for all. Our prayerful hope is that each of you found the reflections of our panelists to be both enlightening and engaging. I know I did. But the journey itself must be about more than just talk. So I leave us with this question. What are we going to do about the lingering, persisting inequities that have been embedded in our laws and culture for centuries? And where do we begin as individuals to challenge the structural racism that threatens our future and the futures of our children as a region, as a nation? Here are 5 initial actions we could take. First, support organizations committed to racial equity efforts. Second, challenge discriminatory policies within your organizations. Third, familiarize yourselves with laws and policies at the local, state, and national levels related to racial equity. Fourth, join your civic league and get to know your neighbors. And fifth, continue to engage with those you know and start to engage with those you do not know on race and its impact on this grand experiment that is our American democracy. Because, my friends, at the end of the day, The business of an equitable and just society starts with us. Again, many, many thanks for tuning in. As my colleague, Vice President Oden, likes to say, we hoped you learned something that you'll share with someone. For more information about the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and our commitment to racial equity, please visit our website at www.hamptonroadcf.org. There you can also access some great resources that our partners, Hunton, Andrews, Kurth, and Kaufman and Knowles have assembled for us to read along the journey. Have a great evening.